To the latest edition of the Radical Imagination. I'm Michael Pelias, one of the co-hosts today, with the other co-host, Peter Bratsis, here to my left, and our special guest, Arun Gupta. And today we will be talking about desire, populism, and the specter of Donald Trump. I'm adding the specter because I think it is the new phantasmagoria that affects us all, and he has become pretty much of a national nightmare. And we will talk about this today with our special guest, Arun Gupta. We're going to work with this triad and try to show the interrelationships between desire and populism, and how the populace has been captured by Trump, and also speak to some of the aspects on the other side of the political spectrum, Bernie Sanders, in the drive to claim the middle class as part of the new voting bloc that may swing an election or at least give some credence to one's candidacy in this upcoming presidential election. It's been said that this election, all the elections in 2016, will cost over $5 billion, and I just want to make our viewers aware that is the equivalent of about 10% of the interest on student loan debt in the United States. So this is going on in one spectacle that pretty much began, I'd say, about 6 months ago, and now we're beginning to get into the beginning of the crunch time. So today, without further ado, I want to introduce our good friend Arun Gupta, who is a contributor to the Washington Post, The Nation, The Progressive, among many other in these times, and was the founder of the Occupied Wall Street Journal, a very original idea and a newspaper at the time of the Occupy movement. And I was there when they were printing it and distributing it on a 24/7 basis back during the glory days of Zuccotti Park, if you will. So we're very happy to have Arun. Arun is also someone that travels the United States and is not just a journalist or your average journalist. He speaks to people. He speaks to people in everywhere from bar rooms to diners, everywhere he goes. So you could say he's kind of one of our great ethnographers of our time, especially on the political spectrum. And of course, again, my good friend Peter Bratsis, my co-host, is here. So we're going to have a conversation, but we would first open it up with Arun to try to set the stage for explaining this ongoing popularity of Donald Trump. Maybe where did it come from? How did this develop? And then we'll kind of unfold from there. So Arun, please.
So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Donald Trump obviously has a lot of support. We know where his support is concentrated. It's among white working class Republicans, those who do not have a four-year college education. It also happens to overlap with this recent study showing that the middle-aged white working class is now they're losing life expectancy, that their life expectancy is declining. It has been declining for about the last 10 or 15 years. So it's people who are very angry about their social status, their economic situation, a segment of the population that has a lot of problems in terms of healthcare, jobs, drug addiction, and Donald Trump is offering them very simple answers, very appealing answers. They're very emotional answers, and now this is the flip side of Bernie Sanders. I think we can see that the two candidates are both responding to the same crisis, but and there's some commonalities between them, but generally it's a response in a very different manner. For Donald Trump, it's much more emotional. It's laden with violence. It's also interjected very much with virility and vigor. It's I think it's fair to say it's very fascistic in nature. Whether or not it's a fascist movement is a different question, but it certainly is starting to have the trappings of such, that it's a cross-class collaboration. You have a segment of the working class and a segment of the elites who are against another segment of the working class. We should consider undocumented immigrants. This is not an ethnic group. This is a huge part of the working class, and it's a huge part of, we're talking 11 million people, obviously not all workers, but a high percentage of them are of working age. But they're very important to capital. They're this low-wage shadow workforce that can be super exploited and that help to bring down wages, benefits, and standards for workers across the country. And yet, rather than try to uplift them and say, hey, we need to bring them out of the shadows, Donald Trump comes in and says they are your problem. Or he says Muslims are your problem. There it's a little more complicated because, Muslim Americans are not, we can't consider them so much a segment of the working class in terms of undocumented immigrants. Of course, they are workers, but economically they tend to be better off. But this is where we start to get into what we can call white revanchism, this idea of taking back America, which is very much tied in with the Tea Party. There's, I think, we can't say that the Tea Party overlaps, is identical to Trump's base. But there is definitely a line that goes from the Tea Party to what we're seeing now that includes Donald Trump, the Make America Great Again, this idea that somehow we become weak, our vigor is being sapped, and who is sapping it? It's the undocumented immigrants who are sapping our economic vigor. It's countries like China that are beating us out, competing us, and then it's Muslims who are this fifth column that's undermining us from within. But it's this very emotional, violent appeal, and it's very gratifying, I think, to a lot of people that they get a pleasure out of this violence, and that's very important to understand. It's something that we don't see as on display on the left as much, or even when we do see it on display, the left can be very conflicted about it. I think there are legitimate reasons to be conflicted about the use of violence. Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century philosopher, points out that when you engage in violence, that you lose forces beyond your control, that you don't know that this is different than the nature of labor, that you're not going to know the results of your action, and that it will inevitably spin out of your control. So there is that kind of, I think, caution that we should approach violence with. But then we also have kind of, I think, a lot of liberal and juvenile attitudes about violence is bad, and we should all be treat each other like kindergartners, and
So you've raised multiple explosive themes. I'd like to stop for 1 second and maybe back up a little bit. You mentioned the Tea Party formation. I mean, one question I would have is Marco Rubio and obviously Ted Cruz are also part of a kind of Tea Party formation. Why haven't they exploded in the polls like a Trump, and they actually still have the records of being anti-abortion, immigration? We have this this kind of moment with them. What would explain the Trump moment in a more in a deeper way, if you will, maybe around both his image and what we refer to as maybe a specter at this point too?
Even though both Rubio and Cruz are known as bomb throwers, and they serve in the U.S. Senate, and they're known for being inflammatory, for upending the norms, the genteel norms of that august institution. They're still bound by the bourgeois politics to some degree. Whereas for Trump, he's not bound to it by
Interesting.
anything. I mean, he's not bound by norms. Just look at his hair. You know,
Right.
look at his succession of mail order brides. You know, look at this is a guy who says that he would be dating his daughter, fornicating his daughter if she wasn't his daughter, and it never hurts him really.
Right.
So obviously, and we can't also divorce it from just the simple fact that he has this celebrity appeal for decades, that he's been this reality television star, but it's also the liberatory power of money. You know, that in our society, money is very much equated with liberation. You know, in terms of, I sometimes point out, and people on the left get very upset, that the working class tend to have more faith in the lottery than the political system. Otherwise, they wouldn't be playing it so much. And so, you know, it's in our society we all dream of. Even for a lot of Marxists, I think, you know, they're seduced by the effective qualities of capitalism, that we see money as liberation, and it is a form of liberation. And so you get this guy up there who can say anything, who can do anything, and at the same time, he's pointing out everyone else. You know, he's like, they're all bought off. He said that publicly. He's, you know, said the emperor has no clothes, which, you know, the politicians are never supposed to say, the corporate media is supposed to say, and, you know, he's gotten up there and said it. They're all bought off. They're just in the pocket of the donors, and it's just like, I can't be bought off. You know, this was also Michael Bloomberg, you know, the mayor of New York,
Yes,
the wealthiest
right,
man in New
right,
York City,
right.
would use the same logic. You know, we find this increasingly commonplace actually around the world, the idea that to be wealthy is to be liberated.
Let's go back a few years. You had written a long piece on the Tea Party, where, among other things, you had gone undercover in meetings. You had gone to various branches and canvassed people. Can you explain why you think the Tea Party should be thought of within the bounds of a populist movement, and how the Trump candidacy is still within that context?
Well, you know, the concept we're using comes from, you know, in terms of populism, Ernesto Laclau, and the Tea Party, it brought the people into being. You know, it was make America great again. We're going to retake America. We're going to return to the founding fathers, the virtues of, you know, discipline, the pleasure of violence, you know, smashing the barrels of tea and throwing them overboard. And if we can recreate the people, that will revive America. And so it was populist because it did give people an identity. It did create this notion of a beloved community. And it is a necessary relationship when you have community. It is, you know, the community by who you exclude. So with the Tea Party, it was, you know, people on welfare, people who are getting food stamps, again, undocumented immigrants. Also, you know, that's when the Muslim, Obama's a Muslim meme starts the rise. And you can actually track.
Which Trump was one of the main.
Right. Yeah, but so,
proponents
you
of
know,
that.
back in 2008 when Obama starts running, you know, and what I did is, like, I look at the demographic data because this is very important, and especially how it overlaps with the socioeconomic variables. So in terms of the Tea Party, starting in 2008, it was something like 7% of, I believe it was, Republicans, I want to say the general population, but it might have just been Republicans, that believed Obama is a Muslim, and it starts to go up steadily. By 2011, which is of course the 10th anniversary of September 11th, and we also have this absurd controversy that was ginned up by Fox News and the right about the Park 51 mosque in downtown. It was just, you know, an equivalent of a YMCA.
Right.
It was an interfaith cultural center that was going to be in downtown Manhattan. By the fall of 2011, you get 46% of Republicans believing that Obama is a Muslim. So it is this very type of exclusionary system, and where people, they didn't have, there wasn't one leader, right? That's very important to populism, is that the people channel their energies through the leader. But we see a lot of this, kind of notion that we're going to retain our vitality. Like you have these middle-aged and old white men, with their pot bellies, dressing up like founding fathers with their tricolor hats. They see themselves as something heroic. They also, in terms of Wilhelm Reich talks about in the mass psychology of fascism, that the Nazis bought the new into politics. Occupy Wall Street did that as well. When I talked to Tea Party members, a number of them would say, and often, this is a self-editing of their own history, but they would they use the same phrases. Like, I was just sitting on the couch yelling at the TV. I didn't think I didn't realize that there were thousands of people like me. And so it's bringing the new into politics. You're not just reshuffling who's already out there. That's very important to a populist movement. And I think Trump is, he is the channel in terms of the classic populist leader. Certainly the fascists or the Peronists, who represent all these ideas, embody them in the person.
Yeah. What's interesting this time, at least, in the Republican, the debates as well as the various campaigns, is that the religious right has sort of been displaced by a flamboyant playboy, right? Which is very interesting because, as you know, the Republican Party, one of its base that maybe led into the Tea Party was the fundamentalists, that faction. And they really don't have that much of a voice. I'm sure they're behind the scenes and they would go, but on the surface, we're not really hearing much about the religious right at this point. Okay,
that's true. I wouldn't,
Yeah.
I think that's accurate.
Okay.
They're not playing this driving force that we've seen in the past in terms of defining the agenda for, at minimum, the Republican Party nationally, but they're very much there. They haven't gone anyway.
Right.
Evangelicals still make up about 30% of the Republican voting base. For one, Trump is bypassing Iowa, where the evangelicals are very strong. He's basically giving up on Iowa, and just, for him, the primary begins with New Hampshire.
Right.
Also, let's not forget that just because they are not in the national spotlight doesn't mean that they aren't out there and being very effective. Especially what we see in this kind of organized misogyny and the war on reproductive rights. Last year over 400 anti-abortion bills were introduced around the country. And this is very much pushed by the evangelicals. We also saw this, what if we can call a terrorist attack in Colorado Springs against a Planned Parenthood clinic. And of course, Colorado Springs, that is the nerve center for the evangelical right. So, but that is, it is an important point to make, because the Tea Party, there were all sorts of Tea Party groups initially, dozens and dozens. Some of them were kind of astroturf groups, or they were basically opportunists. There were the Koch brothers, there were various Americans for Prosperity, but there was also a lot of legitimately grassroots Tea Party groups being set up. But they would actually ban discussion of kind of the culture wars on their listservs. They're like, hey, this is too divisive, that we don't want to get into it. But at the same time, you'd look in various states like South Carolina, evangelicals were a very important force in the Tea Party there. So it's a mixed picture. But I think one of the most interesting bits of it's a number of pieces of data that I correlated in terms of the Tea Party. So when we look at what is the image of a Tea Party member? It's an older white male, usually around 50. not necessarily Christian. They are often libertarian, secular, slightly above middle class. You know, in terms of the median income, often like in the managerial, semi-professional, self-employed. So you know that it's a dying segment of the population. And you know, before people gloat, I'll just also throw in that so is organized labor, right? If you look at who organized labor is, something like 1/4 of workers who are 60 or older are unionized,
Right.
which means that organized labor is literally dying off. But the same is with the Tea Party. These are people who are literally, it's a demographic that's literally dying off.
Right.
And there may be some overlap between people who may be in unions.
Right.
And
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting tangent because I covered the, as Michael mentioned, I go around the country, cover a lot of different topics. I covered the second recall election against Scott Walker in 2012. And so among Tea Party members, he got 92% of the vote. Okay, so if you consider that the other, let's just for sake of argument, you know, we won't talk about like people who maybe like might have voted for some obscure third-party candidate. So you take that 8% difference and subtract it. So that's 0.84%. So 84%, right? That means every Tea Party person who voted in that election, Scott Walker got 7/8 of a vote.
Yeah.
For union members, we're not talking about union households. For union members, 75% of them went for the Democrats. So you subtract that 25%, so that means every union vote only counted 0.5 for the Democrats.
Right.
The Tea Party had much more discipline
Right.
than the union members. I mean, that's just crazy.
Right.
Why would 25% of union members who went to the poll,
Right.
you know, vote for someone other than the Democrat? Not that the Democratic candidate was great by any means, but you know.
But there it could have made a difference.
Yes, and they're just shooting themselves in their own foot. So the Tea Party actually has more kind of ideological discipline than organized labor.
That begs a certain question. I mean, part of your argument is that there is a case of symbolic castration, that there is the interpretation that things in the United States today are not as wonderful as they could be, and the United States used to be a wonderful place, capable of all kinds of great things, but there was a castration, the American phallus, as it were, was cut off, and Trump is going to bring it back. It's going to make America great again, capable of enjoyment and economic growth and prosperity. That begs a certain question.
And that phallus will have an orange toupee.
And also,
Well,
I just want to
perhaps.
interject real quickly. Also, Putin likes him. So you have a kind of phallus
Yes.
in Russia that's going to bring back
But
the
machismo
glories
is-
of
yeah.
the 19th century Russia
Right,
as a
right,
great
right, yeah,
imperial power.
Yeah, yeah.
Going forward.
Fascism
so this
likes
is very,
fascism.
very interesting kind of combination here, working globally. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Please.
No, but that
Yeah,
begs the
yeah.
question, why the particular narrative?
Right.
Because you could couch that in multiple ways. It could be, and that happens, that also Trump also toes this line when necessary, that it's the greedy Wall Street financiers who make money out of nothing and who sap, you know, the real resources from the real economy, the productive economy. And he builds real things, buildings and wonderful, you know, beautiful buildings, wonderful buildings.
Of course,
all
he could never
very
exist without the financiers.
That might, well, that's undoubtedly
And
true.
in fact, they own him.
They bailed him out multiple
Unfortunately,
times.
They bailed him out so many times. And, you know, he's basically
it's-
owned by the banks. But please,
Well,
come. So, you know.
It's the same thing
If
Bernie-
we all had that problem,
Materially. We
if we all
also
had
have
that problem, yes,
That's
you know,
correct.
that's not a horrible way of
That's right.
Yeah.
being owned
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
people. But it begs the question: why does the narrative that really works, that gets people on board, narratives that explain it through some foreign contamination? I mean, why is it reasonable for a significant portion of Americans, whatever that number is, 30% of Republicans, 40%, which is a big, you know, significant part of the population, to believe that Obama is some kind of a secret agent, you know, a communist Islamicist undercover smuggled in when he was 1 week old from Kenya. Because if you were going to take over the country, that's what you would do in 1962, whenever it was, 63. You would smuggle a baby
It's
from
a
Kenya.
brilliant strategy.
Yes, it's a brilliant
Yes,
strategy.
yes.
It's worked out quite well.
So the question is,
A
why
very
does
good movie in the making.
it should be?
Yes, indeed.
No one would believe it.
No, of course.
So the question is, why does that work? Why does that narrative, that it's these foreigners or this foreign presence that has come into the United States, why is that an effective narrative?
Well, okay, so we can counterpose that to the Bernie Sanders narrative, right? You know, that it's much more about the, he also says, you know, this is about the casino capitalism, you know, I would, and I think he's been rightly criticized, just drop the modifiers, right? This is capitalism, right? But in any case, he is much more pointing to a system. When you have a systemic analysis, it requires a certain level of intellectual discipline. You know, that you have to put your emotions in check, that you have to put your kind of reptilian brain in check. You have to be able to work through an analysis, consider an argument. And, you know, we shouldn't be classes about this. You know, Bernie Sanders base, they do tend to be, they're middle class professionals, college educated, but intellectual discipline does by no means necessarily correlate with a college education. There are plenty of dumb people
You're
who come out.
talking to two professors here.
Exactly, plenty of dumb people. My highest degree is a culinary school degree, you know, but
Right.
I don't know if I have intellectual discipline. You know, I'll let you decide that. But in any case, and it's an abstract argument. It's harder to pin it on something in particular. You know, when we're talking about Wall Street, that becomes more a category for a system. It's you know, synecdoche, one part representing the whole. That what we mean when we say Wall Street, we're just using that as shorthand for capitalism. You know, whereas when Trump talks about it's the Mexicans, you know, it's much more visceral, and you can feel it and palpable, and you can also take your aggression out on people who are next to you. People, I think it's
a more concrete enemy.
I mean, I don't want to naturalize it, but there is something in terms of human nature to
Right.
it.
No, that's interesting, yeah.
You know,
as you say, Wall Street's an abstraction for,
Yeah.
you know, finance capital in particular, and
Right.
those latest, you know, goings on of,
right.
you know,
I mean,
creating
we've
products that are
we've definitely
very
seen
hard
that.
for people to, you know, yeah.
Yeah,
Go
we've
ahead.
definitely seen this huge rise in hate crimes
Yes.
since the attacks in San Bernardino. You know,
Right.
and of course, I think it's important to point out, you know, that the FBI has now admitted that there was no public social media posting about calls for jihad. But in any case, and you see just there are many reports of this, and of course, for however many reports there are, you know, that's usually the tip of the iceberg of people being attacked, especially a lot of women who wear the hijab, you know, and really it's just like these are not, you know, we shouldn't victimize these women, but they're hardly like have a lot of social or violent force in our society, but they're representative to a lot of white Americans, and they're easily able to take out their aggression. It's a form of pleasure that they get. You know, with the recent Republican debate, we had them competing to, you know, who would bomb children, who would bomb more children. You
Right.
know,
Ben Carson is ready to bomb them all.
well,
He's ready.
well, I mean, my question is, but are they ready to bomb the unborn children?
Right.
You know,
Well-
you should. I mean, are we willing to do that? Shouldn't
Yeah.
we at least wait for these
Well,
little
that's a new
little
level of smart bombs. I don't think they've
the
developed
little
bombs.
proto-terrorists to be born before we can bomb them? We can't
Well,
bomb them.
it used to be the fear of the black planet. Now it's the fear of the Islamic planet, the fastest growing
Yeah.
religion, as well as, you know, representing 1 billion people versus this, you know, probably 75 to 100 million in the United
and speaking of
States.
education,
Yeah.
I
Right.
went to I attended the National Sheriff's Association conference in Baltimore earlier this year, and they invited the presidential candidates to come by and speak, and Ben Carson came by and spoke. The guy's crazy. I mean, he's just like, racism doesn't exist. I've never had to deal with racism in my entire life. He just tells white people what they want to hear. But he's an example of someone who's obviously, the book, I don't know, autobiography, Gifted Hands. He's obviously someone who's extremely well educated in a discipline,
Right.
but he says just this totally off the wall stuff. That the Egyptian pyramids were these granaries for Joseph, which is just absolutely absurd. So there is no real necessary correlation between education and intellect. And Ben Carson.
We know many people with PhDs who are even worse than that.
Yes.
And I think it's also
At least
important.
Carson has hands.
Yeah. I mean, if this was fiction, it would be hilarious, right? It's just like, for instance, we see this trend with the Republican Party. There's this element of a minstrel show. Every
Yeah, that's
4
interesting.
years,
Yeah.
you get this totally
Right.
crazy black Republican.
Right.
In the last 12 years alone, you've had Alan Keyes, and then
Right.
you had Herman Cain, and now you have Ben Carson.
Carson.
And they have to be the craziest one,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's just like the phenomena, that a lot of African Americans and women generally encounter. They have to be twice as competent in the workplace to be perceived as just being as good as the white men, the one who have all the who've had the historic affirmative action. Seemingly in the Republican primary, the black candidate has to be twice as crazy as
Right.
every
Well, you put it
everyone
well,
else.
the minstrel show.
Yeah.
Right. Very well.
Becca.
Yes.
What was it? It was Herman Cain's. Becca Stan, or whatever.
Right.
Remember that?
Right.
Yeah. The guy was he was unhinged, and the Republicans seem to thrive on this. And
But to go back to your argument on how the narrative works, of the dangerous Mexicans or
right.
the even more dangerous, of course, Muslims. It seems that when you talk about concreteness, the concreteness is not in terms simply there are people you can point to, because you can also point to financiers and bankers.
Right.
But that there is a concreteness in terms of how we perceive them getting their pleasure. The Mexicans are criminals by their nature. They enjoy the criminality, or they want easy money without having to work for it, and they come here because there's easy money. The Muslims are trying to make everyone into
Right.
Muslims, and they want to impose Sharia law, and
Right.
that's how they get their satisfaction. So there's a concreteness in terms of how those groups get their enjoyment that limits then us. It is a threat, and we should be afraid of them, and it is a limit. And an explanation as to why things are not better than we think they should be.
Right.
So that's the concreteness that you
Yeah.
refer to?
Let me just add one thing to that. Another thing that's happening, at least to my mind, is there's a major displacement for all the black youth that have been left behind during the last, during the Obama administration. We're witnessing 50% unemployment levels in a lot of the large cities, right? We are, this question is not really brought up anymore. We see a lot of reverse affirmative action programs with Supreme Court's cases now too. So in a strange way, which was, basically the real issue in this country, racism, has been displaced by this external threat, as Peter points, to the Mexicans that are criminal by nature, or the Muslims who have, quote, infiltrated and are trying to convert us to, Sharia law.
We should also add, we've seen a lot of
yeah.
attacks on Black Lives Matter.
Yes, yes.
Like I was
But,
really noticing this. And when I was at the Sheriff's Association conference, Mike Huckabee also came and gave a speech. It was pure law and order. He even used that. 20 minutes of Nixonian, and it was very clear that he was trying a Nixonian strategy. And we've seen a lot of different attacks by police officials, by Republicans, by district attorneys on the Black Lives Matter movement. Fox News, I think it was Bill O'Reilly who called them terrorists. So, there is still that. The African Americans are still being scapegoated. It has less traction,
Yes.
which is what's interesting.
And not part of the national conversation
Right.
as we're getting from the
Right.
Trump, especially during the Republican and really the Democratic Party. As you know,
Right.
Hillary Clinton had paid basic lip service to Black Lives Matter.
Right.
We must legislate, we must do this
Right.
through the system. This is what the struggle's about. So
I mean,
yeah,
I think
it's important to keep this in mind
Yeah.
because, for the left, the so-called Negro question was the question
Yeah.
in the United States, for movement politics. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's a very complex issue because where Black Lives Matter is having the most impact, it's against Democrats, right? So it's been against like Bill de Blasio in New York City, Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. Certainly, it's put the Obama administration on the defensive. Baltimore, who's it? Stephanie Rawlings is she's not running again
No,
though.
she's not.
Okay, so, again, it's these Democratic mayors often
Yes.
where we see it, so, which is a great thing.
Right.
But in Baltimore, was it Black Lives Matter or was it the upheavals?
Probably the Freddie Gray
Right.
thing,
It was Freddie Gray, but the thing is, it's created this moment, right? Where you see where these deaths are, they're incredibly commonplace, and that's what we're learning, that police shootings, that the FBI didn't have a system in place to track them. And now we have, the private sector, The Guardian, The Washington Post are tracking them. At least they're tracking what's been reported. And so it's looking like I think this year the Guardian's database says there's been 940 police shootings, disproportionately African American. So hundreds of I think one statistic is every 28 hours, an African American is killed by police or some sort of private security force. That's approximately 300 a year. So it's what is different is then this killing catalyzes this anger, right? Because that's what happens in these populist moments.
And that's been going on for a long time. That's not a new phenomenon.
Right. And that the killing becomes that the anger is starting to actually coalesce into it has ideas in terms of this is actions that we can take. So then when you get this spark, and these sparks have always been there, this time the spark lights off this combustible social mix. So, I think that's what happened in Baltimore. It wasn't Black Lives Matter per se, but it was I don't think it would have happened without the Black Lives Matter movement that came out of Ferguson. But getting back to this narrative, I mean, again, this Sheriff's Association conference was, spending 5 days.
5 days.
5 days. And again, I was like...
So you suffered for the
Yeah,
craft.
you really suffered for the cause there.
I wasn't advertising the fact I was a reporter, but I wasn't hiding it either. And so at one point, I went to all these panels. I went to one about the border crisis. At one point in 2014, there was something like 10,000 unaccompanied minors and family members showing up in one section of the Rio Grande Valley, essentially the Big Bend area in Texas last spring. And when it came to, this session was being, the speakers were from Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, the leading officials from the office down there. And the room is filled with sheriffs, a couple dozen sheriffs or deputy sheriffs. And when it comes to question and answer, and I think this really gets at what's going on with Trump, they explained that one of they said they have to do all these kind of town halls. And the implication, it was pretty clear in Anglo communities, right? In communities that are like 95, 98% white, because people are freaking out. And they say, you know, these go on for hours, and they say you get asked the same question 10 different ways, and you have to answer that question 10 different ways, even though it's the same exact question. And they were all how does this affect me and my family? Are there terrorists? And here's the real thing. Are they carrying disease? And so it's about the purity of bodily essence.
Purity of race, huh?
Yeah,
right,
you know,
right.
Dr. Strangelove, you
Right,
know. It's that they are literally a disease in our body politic, that they are infecting
Certainly
us.
the fascistic principle of, you know, the 30s, right?
Yeah, do you want to?
No, go ahead. I mean,
No, I know it'd be nice
yeah.
for you to talk about that. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, the whole thing was about, you know, the pure Aryan race, as you know. So,
Right,
you know,
right.
and anything was a disease. And what do you eliminate? You eliminate first and foremost the gypsies, the
Right.
biggest disease,
Right.
the nomadics that will carry disease, you know, without any kind of country or any kind of, you know, systemic belonging to a nation state. And secondly, the communists, because they're organized, right?
Right. And so
And
this
then
is, you know, and
the
we,
homosexuals who were a disease
Right.
to them, and then we see this still playing out,
Right.
and then finally the Jews, and right now it's not the Jews who get the
Right.
brunt of the attack, at least.
and this is why Trump's language, you know, it has this
Right.
dichotomy in terms of he's powerful, he's strong, he's virile, but America has become weak. You know, and we've become weak, and his mocking of that reporter who has the disabilities, you know, it plays into all this. You know, that he is this movement is going to purge these elements that are weakening us. And I think it's just this very, you know, we love to talk about the savagery of, or the mainstream media in this country loves to talk about the savagery and barbarism of ISIS. Just like, you don't need to go over there, you know, we got plenty of it right over here. You know, in terms of I think the Trump base, very much so. But you know, I wouldn't want to also just focus completely on them, because we also have very much a liberal savagery and barbarism. You know,
Excuse me.
you know, Obama's candidacy was very much propelled by his anti-war opposition, and the war in Iraq peaked in 2007. That's when U.S. casualties peaked. Today, 75% of liberals support drone strikes.
Right.
And everything we know, the Pentagon admits this, the CIA admits this. It's these drone strikes that are fueling a lot of the anger against the United States. You know, it's not anti-American anger,
Sure.
it is anger against the states. And we've also heard it from, you know, of the hundreds of quote-unquote terrorist plots since September 11th. You know, the vast majority of them are FBI entrapment plots.
Right. Sure.
You know, some are real, but in those cases, what we see time and again, the perpetrators point to the drone strikes, the bombings in Afghanistan and Pakistan, what's going on in Yemen now, right? You know, we're slaughtering thousands of people through the Saudis, and now we just inked this $60 billion arms deal with the Saudis. I mean, this is just horrendous terrorism, and I think, you know, we shouldn't minimize the loss of human life, but if anyone who's ever seen the movie Dirty Wars, the Jeremy Scahill movie,
yeah.
that was nominated for an Academy Award.
Right.
Just these stunning scenes of Sanaa, the capital.
Right, sure.
It's a unique city, you know. This is part of our human patrimony, you know. That this is something that should be preserved. There's no city like this in terms of the architecture in the world, and we're bombing it into rubble now.
Sure.
You know, and killing thousands of people. And it's just like this is just going to fuel more such attacks as what happened in Paris and maybe what happened in San Bernardino. I was talking to some folks at The Intercept who said that they have some evidence that they say will flip the narrative, but so I don't know
Not
what this.
out yet.
Yeah, it's not.
Glenn Greenwald has to.
Yeah. I don't know.
comb it a little
I
better.
don't know what the exact
Right.
story is,
Yeah.
and
Interesting.
obviously they wouldn't
Yeah.
say. They said there's still some fact checking to do.
Yeah.
But it says it could. But we already see that the narrative there is being undermined.
Yeah. Just going back to Trump for a second, I mean, he is the only candidate that has pointed out the expense of these wars in Iraq and also the complete failure of the United States there. He is really the only one that has hammered this home, and also looking at the dollars spent and how that could have been used for infrastructure in the United States.
Including Sanders.
Including
Sanders,
Sanders, who's not talked about this. And as we know, in some ways, Trump is more, of our kind by criticizing this than Sanders on foreign policy. I'm not saying all aspects, but certainly in terms of pointing out this complete failure of the U.S. In the Middle East and its policy and what the funds could have been used for.
Yeah.
And,
No, I think this is just it's
And this
such
is interesting,
such a crucial point that you're bringing up. On there are many different things to say about this. One broader thing is I think it's a fun game for leftists to play to mock Trump voters, but let's remember there's all sorts of idiocy and pseudoscience on the left. Everything from chemtrails to 9/11 truthers to conspiracy theories like the Bilderberg Group. The left is full of this stuff.
Sure.
But the reason I say this is because the problem with electoral politics is look, we could say certain things. I make the argument, it's just take someone like Paul Krugman. He's not my politics, but generally I'm glad he's out there and has said the things, and meant some of the things that he's said, given the spectrum of debate. Likewise, I'm glad Bernie Sanders is out there and saying some of the thing that he said. But does that mean that one should support him? Hell no. He's working within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a party of Wall Street. It's a party of empire. Bernie Sanders is saying screw you to 95% of the world, right? And let's not forget, first of all, he's not a socialist, right? You look at his policies, he's a mid-20th century Keynesian liberal. That's what his policies are.
At best, a kind of New Deal or,
Right.
recast.
I would recommend people go back.
Yeah.
Normally I don't like to cite Wikipedia, but it was the best place. Go back and look at Jesse Jackson's 1984 platform.
Right.
Way more radical than Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Jackson was calling for a works progress administration.
Sure.
That is you're
Absolutely.
starting to get.
Well, the right was way to the left of the right also.
Of
Yes.
course,
Everyone
yeah.
was way to the left.
Look,
I mean, even
yeah.
at the height of Reaganism, I've argued since Obama came on the scene that he would have been very comfortable in the Republican Party in the 1980s. His policies.
Well, Reagan was probably to the left of Obama in many ways.
Well, and Reagan
Nixon
was
definitely was.
responsible for amnesty.
Nixon's almost a raving leftist,
Oh,
at
of
least in terms
course.
of domestic policies these days.
Yeah. But you can't be there is no socialism without internationalism.
Right, exactly.
And so what Sanders, it's just for one, he's saying screw you to 95% of humanity, but also it's this fetishization of mid 20th century America. I mean, this is one of the things I find kind of really fascinating about kind of both progressives and the Tea Partiers. They idealize the 1950s, but from completely different perspectives.
Right.
For the Tea Partiers, it's kind of this father knows best, this white patriarchy, private enterprise, we're on this upward trajectory, we don't got to deal with women's and Mexicans and uppity Negroes and homos, it's just the white man is leading the way and we're going to the moon, whereas, Krugman and others totally idealize the 1950s. He calls it, I think his term is the Great Convergence, because the bottom and top of the economic spectrum
The
were
interesting
together.
part, start there is you began to have the really great breakthroughs in the arts and in somewhat in some of the race relations because of the great avant-garde of music that's in jazz, especially in the 50s, which was Mingus and Miles and the post-bebop era of Parker, etc. And you had, of course, the Beat Poets. So there was a militancy that was really marginal that people forget in the 50s, and in a way that paved for the so-called cultural revolution of the 60s. But it was very minor, but it did take hold, right? And it was and it goes to show you sometimes during these moments of extreme conservatism that real movements start. Our problem today is has desire just become at the level of affect and no longer is desire. And that this is what's being manipulated so much. The beginning of our show about this triad of desire and populism, maybe it would have been better to just talk about affect and how affect is mobilized, systematized, and how we live in the world of just the spectacle, image, and affect. And no longer is anyone even in touch with desire. And how is it that people can consistently vote against real interests or even begin to take part in a process that has nothing to do.
One
Go ahead,
commonality, I
think,
think, is fear. And the Republican discourse is you should be afraid of the Muslims, the Mexicans, and the Democratic discourse will become you should be afraid of the Republicans.
Right, of course.
The call will be we all should go and vote for Hillary Clinton, most likely.
Right.
Because otherwise we could get a Donald Trump or a Cruz or whoever the nominee will be, and that will be a disaster. How many people, Michael, Arun, are going to browbeat you and say you are not living up to your responsibilities because you refuse to go vote for Hillary Clinton?
Exactly.
And you're opening up the door to these far-right possibilities.
How many Supreme Court justices will we lose again?
Well, I was just about to say that. The Supreme Court, is a great reactionary institution that ultimately, when push comes to shove, will, support the structures of the capitalist state. They're pretty bad on any economic issues. Even the so-called liberal justices. They may not be horrendous on the culture war issues, but they're certainly not very good on economic or workplace issues. But in terms of, I want to challenge.
So we shouldn't be afraid of Donald Trump, right? That's
well,
we should not be
maybe
guided by fear.
Donald, but not Donald Trump.
It's actually it's more do we take. And I don't want to say we because I think there are real dangers here, and especially to Muslim Americans, to undocumented immigrants, to African Americans. I mean, Donald Trump in many ways it's classic producerism and white welfare, right? This notion, producerism goes back to Andrew Jackson, the notion there's this producing class, which meant the white yeoman, and they're beset by parasites from above and below. And we see this theme repeated throughout history, like, a lot of people, I think, on the left who have some understanding of U.S. history, I don't want to say, let's say, romanticize aspects of populism, right, or the New Deal. And populism, the late 19th century, movement, there was some really good aspects about it, but it could also be deeply racist. Sure. At one of the conventions, they called for the government to there was this demand to basically take all this treaty land from Indians and give it to white farmers, and also called for essentially welfare programs, again, for whites. We've seen this revisionist history of the New Deal, which I think is long overdue, that it was welfare for the white working class. Social Security excluded agricultural labor and domestic labor, which was heavily African American. The unionism was Jim Crow unionism. The housing, that was when I think, did Fannie Mae come first? I think Fannie Mae became before Freddie Mac, but that was, government supported.
The woman came before the man.
Right.
That's good. Yeah. Okay.
The government supported housing programs. So it
but
was,
isn't that always? Isn't politics always open to those possibilities, whether it's populist or not?
Could you explain?
I mean, if you have some form of open political system, isn't it always possible that leads to outcomes that oppress or dominate some fractions of the population? It's not only populism that could
Oh,
lead
sure,
to that.
yeah, no, it's not. I'm just saying in terms of our understanding of how Trump fits into this narrative, because the Tea Party was very much, we need to cut food stamps, and we saw, recently
sure.
that Obama
They did.
like somehow like 10 billion in food stamps matters when you have a $1 trillion military budget. But Sanders won't address that, right? It's just like, how are you going to, if you're talking about rebuilding America, whereas Donald Trump will, that's the irony. So
Right.
maybe we take a hit for the rest of the world, except,
And the fundamentalists don't use the Bible to say God only worked 6 days, then he retired as the model?
So to kind of wrap up here, is Donald Trump Hillary Clinton's best friend? And is this a plant for the first woman president of the United States, the possibility of such a thing? Yeah.
Never put anything again past the Clintons.
Okay.
They are the most ruthless political operators of our time. And,
Right.
I think we've seen in the last few months some just, I want to say breathtaking cynicism, but it's pretty typical of the Clinton apparatus. There have been a number of prominent feminist writers who've been going after Bernie Sanders and the quote-unquote brocialists and, accusing them of sexism.
Yeah.
Whereas, okay, it's just like, you want to talk about sexism, how about the Clintons and ending welfare as we know it and throwing millions of women and children, or bombing all these countries, bombing all these women and children.
Great. Okay, listen, I'm sorry we could go on for another hour, but we kind of have to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Arun Gupta.
Thank you, Arun.
We'll have you back, maybe when in the summer.
In
Because
May.
we'll be close.
In May.
Yeah, May,
Okay.
at the time of the Left Forum. And thank you, Peter, for always the insightful political remarks. And I thought this was a very, very good show. We covered a lot of ground. And, hopefully we can build a new left alternative out of some of these discussions. So thank you again. And this is Michael Pelias, the co-host with Peter Bratsis today for the Radical Imagination, saying goodbye, wishing everybody a happy holiday season, and we'll see you again in January. Thank you.